we have, I guess we all have to click that meeting is being recorded. And then we have a lot of boreal forests, mostly in Russia and Canada, some in the United States and Finland, and a few temperate forests, but we've lost most of that. And as we lost it, we lost the oxygen that was going into the air, and we lost a lot of the sequestration or pulling, scrubbing the carbon out of the air, put in there by power plants and put in there by fossil fuel burning. So back to the next one. And so decades ago, I began being forced into restoration by many decisions on nuclear power plants, all kinds of other power plants, and other kind of technical disturbances of the coastline. So I've been in this restoration, regeneration for decades, and people have said, well, we're headed towards sustainability. No, sustainability is neutral in the middle where you see those acres. Now, I have to thank John Gilmore for finding this lovely slide. And regeneration is the upward slope in green toward the right-hand side, and the degeneration is the left-hand side. And I think it's important to realize that Meadows, a lot of the earlier Club of Rome people were talking about minimizing the degenerative, but they might not have had the imagination, they might not have had the insight or willpower to get to the end of the regeneration. But regeneration is done, at least in forests, in two ways. You put things aside and they begin regrowing themselves, or you have an active intervention and you restore, which is what I do under the world's oceans. So you could take that off. Thank you very much, Ryan, for sticking that on. And we're going to hear the rest of this story. We're going to hear the rest of this story in a month from now. But meanwhile, we're pivoting to something which Julia began with her excellent presentation, and that's to positive stories, to positive experience. And my whole experience tells me that when you have an interface, that's where the action and that's where the activity occurs, between interfaces, between the atmosphere, ocean, between the ocean and the sediment at the bottom, between the living cell and the water around it. The interface is where it happens. Each of us is an interface. Each of us has a load of experience with decades of making things better. That's why we were chosen to be here. And each one of us can take our lens of experience and focus that on the other one's talk or moving forward with the unknown. And then we can reflect what we see through our lens, an orange lens, a blue lens, a green lens, and say how this works for us and how the concept that we see on Ted Manning's vast experience with communities, or John Gilmore's vast experience educating the poorest of the poor children in South Africa, or my experience restoring things underwater and on the land. And those interactions at the edge of where we know something, at the interface between known above and known below, are exactly where the concepts are going to pop out. So we encourage each of you to be very, very active about your lens and about your interface and how you see and react to each of the speakers. So we're happy today to have Ted Manning, who has a long experience. He's the president of Tourist Inc., which is a group that does integrative planning of tourism and other cultural heritage communities around 50 nations. He has been a adjunct professor at Carleton with 23 books and 100 articles. But importantly, he was director of sustainable development for the Canadian government, internal policy, and for their international development agency. And he advises several United Nations groups, the World Tourism, Global Sustainability Council, and the UN Industrial Development Organization. And of course, he's been chair of the board at Canadian Club of Rome and a full member of the Club of Rome. So he's going to ask us, can we define well-being? Is it more likely to occur with communities? Should we tell success stories and look at their assumptions? And are these assumptions critical? And can we scale up between us all the success stories into a much larger meta concept? Ted, the floor is yours.
I'll just have to get this thing to work. If it's here, can everybody see what I have there?
Yeah, it's good here.
I think it was exactly on target. I'm going to ask you some questions rather than provide you with answers. With 50 years of experience, I have altogether too many answers, and you guys are going to try and help us figure out which ones might fit. I'm going to start with a hypothesis that well-being happens at the community scale, is perceived at the community scale, and the world is having a much harder time defining what well-being is globally. It needs really to focus on communities where desired outcomes are shared, argued, and negotiated. And it's at that scale, in individual projects, individual communities, small islands, that the definition of what people really want, how to measure it or describe it, and really how to move a community or a town or an ecosystem from one point to another. We've already had a fair bit from ourselves and from other presenters and other people we've been talking to about how bad it is everywhere, how bad it is happening. There are major issues that have been described, and we're very, very good at describing them. In my assessment, we're rather less successful in defining and sharing solutions. And that is part of the reason why I am arguing for a focus down to begin with at what works at a real level in a small community, in a small country, in a small industry, where people can focus on what is really important to them and try and define what they really mean by success. Now, the existential concerns, when added together, certainly are problematic for all of us. But when we actually talk to somebody about them, they and their solutions are most likely to occur at a very small community scale. If somebody asks you to control, design, and manage an entire country, unless it's a very small one, it's going to be a lot more difficult than they charged with the same concern in Castiglione Corfu, where they have a group gets together and argues out exactly where they want to be in the future and what they have in terms of tools, and where they actually are able to bring together the social, the economic, the environmental, and issues of governance together and begin to argue out the trade-offs. What is really interesting is that they are not, of course, out of the loop when it comes to other levels of government and industry. And in fact, when I worked for the Canadian government, a lot of my job was to try and remove the barriers to doing sound environmental planning in small communities, because the barriers that higher levels of government had erected, which really inhibited people from doing something new, something integrative, something jointly with other areas, ended up being major reasons why they were not moving forward to what they really wanted. In fact, they were sometimes even constrained from defining the goals or collaborating with others. What we've done over a number of years is little community level and industry level participatory processes all over the world. And my argument is, and David made it first, I think, which is you can't eat money. When you come up with people looking at a list of what their real priorities are, it's really a huge list. And they do correspond strongly to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This is just a partial summary of what came up most frequently on the lists that we did when we were doing participatory processes in places all around the world. And you can find almost everything there, including references more or less to almost all of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. What is not expressly on that list is money. But it is, of course, there as the means by which some of these other goals can be obtained. And therefore, we're not going to be able to ignore any of the aspects when we look at what the real goal is and really what has to happen to be on that list of well-being. But if you're going to wander into a community or a community of peers, or to an industry association, or even when I did lectures a few years ago on just that subject at the Central Party School of the Communist Party of China, they're all on that list. The point is that most of the common wants and goals in almost every culture tend to be the same. The prioritization is not. And as I'll get to a little later, the means of getting there is not. But the list of goals that people refer to when they talk about what they mean by well-being, it's here. And it's certainly not just one thing. Now, we can't really assume a short list of goals, and that's when we get into a lot of trouble. And that's where we often have people coming up with one thing. We just want to preserve that particular spot, or we just want to make money off of that particular thing. But what we often fail to ask is, what are the real assumptions that people have beyond the goals that they are beginning to cite and the range of means that they are prepared to use to get there? What they may not, in fact, even understand each other is that they're using different terminology to say the very same thing. And on a number of occasions, I've been the mediator between groups who have been arguing over something until we explained to them that they weren't. In Lake Balaton, one of the first indicators initiatives we did for the UN, we had environmentalists and we had the tourism recreation sector around the same table. First time they had ever spoken to each other. Came in with the assumption that they were wrong, that they were going to fight us all the way, and walked out within 3 days, agreeing on most of the stuff that they needed to do together. The biggest issue was the assumptions they had and the jargon they used. And in fact, you're often making assumptions that somebody else's obsession is wrong, when in fact they may just be saying it differently. So part of the problem we've had in almost all the places we've worked is to get people to clearly define the goals that they have, to clearly talk about long-term goals, and by and large define what they mean or want by well-being. And that becomes a key to conversations regarding what is of value and what needs to be retained, conserved, or protected. And this becomes the point where the other values that perhaps other people do not consider come into the equation, come into the dialogue. So how are you going to find this out? Well, I'm put at the back, somewhat glib tactics, just ask. But that has been very important in dealing in small communities, in dealing in different cultures. The fact is that people desperately want to be asked. And when we were doing the work in coastal Africa, trying to develop new communities along the coastal zone. In Kenya and in Tanzania, in some cases, it was the first time a bureaucrat had ever talked to them, had ever asked them anything. And they were rather surprised when we came in and started asking questions. They were used to being dictated to. And they said, meaning you're actually going to ask us what we want and what training we need to do it and what areas we need help in, instead of coming and simply reading the edict and going away. So we have found in almost every culture, having the right people with you and asking what they really want is a wonderful way to find out what they really value and what they may in fact believe to be important to their well-being. A lot of the work I've been doing is with the World Tourism Organization and with that sector, because it is now the world's largest economic sector. It employs more than agriculture, forestry, and mining combined. And it is a major impact on precious areas, small communities, cultures worldwide. And we've been doing work for them for about the last 30 years in developing measures, planning processes, indicators, and ways of delivering a more sustainable and ecologically balanced form of development to places all around the world. Most of the work has been on heritage sites, small communities, and on tourism destinations. And a lot of it, unfortunately, has been trying to find the right tactics to diminish their impact, to redirect it, or at the very least get their participation in integrating environmental preservation and social preservation with their economic development. And that remains a challenge in almost all parts of the world. It is not easy because, particularly in the tourism sector, as I say, I've done a lot of work lately on, is that the kinds of places that are desired are very desired. Too many people want to do too many different things there. And one of the biggest issues is to try and get people to define a future that they believe to be acceptable, a future that they wish to participate in. And for places like Machu Picchu here, it has been a real fight to try and get the local community to be considered part of the dialogue, because most of the planning was in fact happening elsewhere, as far away as Geneva, where they were looking at the criteria for preservation of that site. And it's been a big challenge in World Heritage Sites to get all of the stakeholders, global down to local, to actually listen to each other and to understand that the values that are associated with each user or each potential user are in fact worthwhile considering and weighing. And a big issue with a lot of these is the decision power is not organized. Only in World Heritage Sites have we actually got the reasonable capacity to try and pull them all together for integrated planning, and where the aspirations of everyone involved is really there. In every culture, there are different approaches to deciding what is important and who gets to make those decisions. In this particular site in Cameroon, where we were working on developing a new community where they thought they would try and get visitors, the real decision makers were in fact the fisheries co-op, and they were the unofficial decision makers, the traditional members of those commons. And once again, trying to bring them completely into what was otherwise a government orchestrated planning procedure was very difficult. Not simple, but if you don't do it, it definitely is not going to work. And we have identified a number of success stories around coastal Africa and many other places in the world where there are working models of how to get cooperative and collective decisions on what works for them. We've used essentially an analytical approach with participatory processes, with the use of development and use of indicators which are now in use in most countries in the world based on what we did through the UN, that tries to identify all of the factors that people need to be sensitive to and integrate them into the actual decision process. We've also tried to bring risk management into it too. Phuket was the first time we actually got to do that, just after the tsunami, where the problem was that most of small communities do not have adequate risk assessment in place. And there are now new standards being developed to have them understand how to value external changes and threats, such as climate change, and increasingly also things like COVID, and where they can actually try and build information into contingency planning that gives them half a chance to react. So then we come down to, what do we really want to keep? This is Big Sur, California. How many people can we cram in there? What should people be doing? What is the sensitivity of that experience or that environment to numbers and to behaviors? And how about this one? 7 ships one day in the community of St. Philip, or of Phillipsburg, which has its own population is about 1/8 of the number of people who pour off cruise ships on Tuesdays. Again, the argument we've been having with some of the ports for cruise ships are really how many, how much, what is the limit for them of the acceptable change they're prepared to countenance. And quite frankly, very little ability to build sensitivity to climate change, to impacts of major external players on small communities. I don't consider this one a success story, but it's there for contrast. And certainly it presents its own demonstration of what the maximum impact of people in one place can in fact bring. Now, the tourism sector, which, as I say, I've been working in quite a bit, and with the UN and UNESCO sites, deals a lot with the idea of what is the limit to acceptable change. How much change will a place ecologically support? How much change will a community culturally support? Does it have the capacity to support other major changes from any perspective? In Sitka, Alaska, how many tourists can visit before the whales aren't there anymore? How much contamination can you pour in before that is harmed? What are the desired, accepted, and tolerated changes? And it's really at the community level that the actual decision of whether you put in a power plant, whether you, in particular in Alaska, they're looking at putting in more hydroelectric plants just to get the cruise visitors onto electrical connections whenever they're ashore, thereby cutting almost half the contamination coming from their visit. Also a question of, is change in fact allowed? The work we've been doing in Jeddah has to look at how rapidly that grows and how rapidly that can grow at the expense of the local cultural community. These questions asking how much, involving whom, for whose benefit, and with whom are they shared is particularly almost different, I would say, when you get into a culture like Saudi Arabia, and where the concept of what the limits of what is likely to be acceptable and how much alteration can be managed is quite different. Again, questions one must ask, questions very difficult to answer because they are so very culturally determined. And there's also the question of the limits of acceptable control. Austria, it has one of the strongest control societies around. Even information, they ask for information from somebody arriving each night in the community in Vienna or anywhere else, a lot more information that most North Americans would even admit, even to the census taker. When you arrive at a hotel in Vienna, they want to know where you were last night, how long it took you here, how much it cost you to get here, how much did you spend yesterday. Essentially, about the only thing they didn't ask for was your shoe size. And the point being that they felt that a control-oriented society was going to give them the values that they felt most critical to sustain in Austria. So community goals become very important and are very hard to group together, because they focus on individual societies' risks and hopes. You need to understand what are their key measures, what do they key on, what assets they actually value most, and are they prepared to participate in deciding what's important to them. One of the interesting things I brought up when I gave a talk like this a few weeks ago was on the idea of when you're doing participation and when you're talking to communities, you don't just talk to the adults. And in fact, we had a bit of a breakthrough in the Rockies a few years ago when we actually began to talk to interview the children to find out what they really wanted, and to find out, when we were trying to do a comprehensive replan for a large part of the Rocky Mountains, what was most important to them. As it was a Walmart was what they wanted most when they were actually asked. Now, we didn't give them one, in fact, but it was showing the degree to which other people's attitudes were being colored by what people told them they should get, what they saw on TV, and their idea of living in a community in Jasper, Alberta, which is one of the most beautiful mountain communities around. Their idea of a good time was to go to a shopping mall. So it is rather difficult to predict what people will ask for when they decide what's important. When they are given the chance, some work we did last year in Ecuador was to help them develop a new community based on shared visions. It was an old community. It's been repurposed. It's been regenerated by the people themselves to try and share their agriculture, share their culture, share their community. And a big part of the work there was helping them develop shared visions. And this community is working quite well because of the fact that while they have changed the community into being a community that serves the people going by on the roads and do get people in to eat and sometimes to stay overnight, they have retained most of the things that are most important to them. And they have been working together because a shared vision was possible to be able to mobilize other resources from elsewhere, including from international NGOs, to help them do that. So what then do we really mean when we say to restore, regenerate, transform, or reposition? Both of these pictures are of communities which once were very different for different purposes, for essentially the same cultures, of course, past generations. And they have been modernized. The people living in the longhouses and near them in Kasan have TVs, have cell phones, have access to the outside, and they have actually managed to retain a significant part of their culture and to show it off. Very same in Banska Štiavnica in Slovakia. These are compromises between modernization, revenue, jobs, and culture. And both of these would be considered success stories at the local level. The same with this one, total repositioning of a fishing village in Zhejiang, China, where essentially they have successfully removed all of the vehicles from the center. They've bringing all the people in using traditional boats, And the is no longer a fishing village, but it is a replica fishing village. So I'm back to the questions to you. What do you mean by recycle, reposition, renew? San Miguel de Allende is another one we did recently on the idea of limits of capacity and sensitivity. In this particular case, they had the fortune and or misfortune of being chosen by Condé Nast Traveler as the nicest small town in the whole planet to visit. And very shortly thereafter, way more people than they could possibly handle came. And it has been a big job to essentially change the rules so that what is worth retaining still is. And where essentially the big one there is to try and retain people, but not cars. To try and limit the accessibility for people who are not on foot or who are not using electric vehicles now going around down the town. We did a specific study on this one, looking at the key indicators for them, because once again, the community itself is participating in a dialogue regarding what they are prepared to allow to change. There are also places in the world that are looking at the notion of us becoming a sanctuary place where you can get away. Now, they're claiming they won't claim you can get away from climate change, but they will claim you can get away from COVID, and you can get away from the rest of the world. And places like St. Lucia are actually looking at COVID vaccinated only coming in with sanctuary resorts. And the limits to acceptable change are that they will begin to limit their own and others' freedoms from a different perspective to allow them to be safe. And clearly on the list, security and safety has a reasonable amount of preeminence in the current discussions we're having through the Caribbean Development Fund. So we found that the program we've developed through the UN agencies is to identify a range of indicators that respond to the key values of the people who live there and bring them information for risk management. But the biggest challenge for them is to decide, as we said, what do they really want to sustain for the future? And what do they mean by their own well-being? We've done workshops in the last few years in all of the places listed here that have been focused just on that. The notion of what can develop, what are the limits, what are the key criteria. And these are available. And if anybody wants to read them, we've got all kinds of reports and books on them. I've summarized a few of the things from them. But the whole idea is that we're looking at how do we create at the village level or at the community level or at the small island level, a future that's acceptable, a future where they actually discuss what they want for the future. What are the key limits for them? Not to discount their future, but to understand how to create robust systems and resilient systems that respect the cultural and natural environment. And also to build risk management into their actual discussion. We're looking at how do we take the community level bigger. We have a system of observatories that I set up when I was first with the UN back about a couple of decades ago, and it's now going all over the world, where they are exchanging information directly and models through the UN World Tourism Organization. There's a major issue known as transformational tourism, or building better out of COVID, that is going on. And we've been setting up collaboration amongst communities through small island developing states, through city coalitions, through a number of NGOs focused on shared issues like wildlife preservation and some joint interventions. The idea being that adaptive planning can help do something. Again, what are we trying to do? We're trying to share success stories. We're trying to provide guidance to each other. But the big challenge now is how are we going to get there from here? Are these local and community models scalable, replicable? What about equity and inequality? Are we only going to keep the the nicest place is good and deck with the rest. How do we communicate up from these communities to try and alter the entire dialogue? I have a number of friends in small island developing states who think they are being reasonably successful getting them all to work together to lean on organizations like the UN and to try and jointly make presentations at IPCC, to try and find a way to exercise their joint pressure from 40 different countries to remove key obstacles, because they know they're part of a global commons, trying to stay alive as the sea level rises. And a key challenge for them is to agree on desired futures, but also to try and bring the big guys in to get them to actually listen. Now
Ted,
we've got,
we're half an hour into this, okay?
yeah, and you've got about 2 minutes left, and then you can start asking other questions.
Great,
So
thanks.
about right, yeah. I was just going to say we've done a number of very specific studies on places like the Philippines, Cyprus, Cape Breton Island, Chaguaramas, Trinidad, places where we've been looking very specifically at case studies of what is possible to create a community that is ecologically sound, socially alive, and economically able to support itself. So the common observations as we get to the last slide or two are to try and get people to agree what and why to sustain it, to try and share assumptions, to try and develop rules that everybody actually understands, to understand how they can communicate with each other regarding levels of stress, but also to realize that almost every community is unique. And the biggest problem is any solutions that we are developing will actually end up being delivered one community, one country, one factory, and one sector at a time. And that is not going to be easy. And if you have answers, we would very much like to steal them. So can we define the futures that we want? Because it's very easy to define the futures we don't want. How are we going to build on these success stories, and can they be rolled up? Are our shared assumptions likely, sorry, I hit too hard here, assumptions likely to be true? Because the more we question them, the more we find that there are disputes over what we really think we can project or predict. And can we also build in lifelong learning that includes valuing all of the global systems and the components in the future? In other words, what do we really want to sustain? And how can we foster a debate at all scales that will allow us to identify what needs to sustain and to motivate actions? And I will quit there with that. And I've thrown a number of questions on over the last few slides to ask you, and here's a few references, they'll be in the program, but really, what are we really going to be able to do to make a difference? To take all of the very good individual success stories that I know each of us have, I've heard several of you already, and roll them up to the point where together they can in fact make a difference. And I'm ready to let you guys answer the questions or ask them or whatever you wish.
I think you've given us a great deal to think about, Ted, and I congratulate you on such a global effort, because indeed you've tried to put down this pattern in 5 continents and in a great variety of different cultures, from simple peasant cultures to very sophisticated. And I think we've all learned a lot about how these simple questions of sustainability and so forth have worked. I'd like a few people to reflect on how they see this as concepts that are scalable and concepts that are movable in a forward sense versus their own lens that they bring in. In the case of Julia, it's medicine and a governmental sense of well-being. In the case of Marilyn, it's education of women and minorities, and John has education of the poorest sector and so forth. And of course, Tom has communities brought to better levels of wellness. So why don't we start with John Gilmore, and how do you see this vast experience through your lens of educating people from the lowest sectors?
Well, thank you, Ted, for a very thought-provoking set of experiences shared, as well as really deep questions and complex questions. I want to identify strongly with your notion that it's one community at a time. Within the community, it's one family at a time. But we have to find suitable units, and we've got to never ignore the family, because healthy families make healthy communities. And so in the education sphere, we build family structures and extended family structures, to use the African tradition. So you create family where you don't have family. It's not family that is defined biologically, but family that is created by bonds and commitments and shared experiences. And so what I really relate to is your sense of any kind of intervention work must boil down to community, in not just engagement, but community participation, and ultimately communities regenerating themselves without the assistance of people asking the questions as to what they need. They need to be taught what questions they would like to hear expressed. And that's quite a delicate process. And that's why in the school context of the LEAP schools in South Africa, we respect the process, that our job is to unlock the metacognition, unlock the ability of our children to view themselves and then to ask the right questions. Because if you do ask questions with a bag under your arm, what do you most need? The average human being will look at what's in the bag and know that that's probably the thing that should be claimed immediately. And so sometimes we're not even aware that as we ask the questions, we have a bag under our arms and we're creating an expectation for an answer. So we really have to examine carefully, what are these questions, and what are we, who are the right people to encourage those questions to be asked. But thank you for provoking this very important conversation about community in particular. One just expression of how our schools served the community during COVID was the schools became hubs for activity, and the schools became the center point for food distribution. The schools became the center point for distributing feminine hygiene products and for actually being a place of retreat when there's violence recently. So the schools are the safe places. And so the school becomes the family, and it can be quite an extended family. And I think that's what we have to say. How does the tourist community become the family for the community? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Did you want to respond to that, Ted?
No, that was a very great statement. I'd like to hear some other people's reactions. I agree with that. I'm going to agree with John, and that's all I need to do. He's right.
Julia, how does this vast amount of knowledge with many, many places interface with your experience of the communities you've worked in?
Thank you, Anitra, and thank you, Ted, for a really thought-provoking presentation. Some of the things that come up for me when I was hearing you share your experience of all the different countries is similar to what John said, the richness of the local and the community. And at the same time that feels really heartening and important, I'm also aware of the big picture paradigm shift that we all need to be moving towards. And of course, those two aren't mutually exclusive. So it's a question of how do we do both? And an interesting conversation that David Corton and I had a while ago was around, what would, for example, what would it look like if we combine something like donut economics as a kind of macro formulation with something like G&H as a more local city kind of measurement. And although we didn't really tease it through very much, the thing that came to my mind was the idea that these local community-based measures can connect individuals to a sense of well-being, and why is this important to them, and what is their voice in that, so that they can feel the tangible benefits of shifting the economic paradigm, which otherwise seems really abstract. So that's where I see a little bit of the local and the global coming together. And maybe just to say, I think, maybe one of the telling experiences from Bhutan is I've heard that at one point Bhutan was considering joining the World Trade Organization. And this was in the early days of when the G&H Commission was coming up with a way of assessing policy tools, assessing policies according to the 9 domains. And at the first glance, without looking at G&H, a lot of the people in government thought, WTO sounds like it could be a good opportunity. Maybe we should go in that direction. But when they carefully took it apart, looking at what would it be its impact on community, on inequity, and all the other things, the decision got reversed. And they realized that it would not be beneficial to join the WTO. So I bring it up because it's a coming together of the local and the global, that if Bhutan were to join the WTO, all the G&H surveys and all the community-based intentions would have a very hard time standing up to the economic pressures that would suddenly be imposed on the country. So I think your presentation really highlights to me the importance of thinking at both of those levels and not keeping them separate. And it also raises questions for me about how to do that.
Well, Julia, there are a few vehicles being developed jointly, not so much by the powers that be, the whole UN committee thing, but rather by the private sector, who are dealing again with tourism, because it is the world's largest industry now. They are developing essentially standards for through the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, which are essentially a set of criteria and indicators for destinations to call themselves, or communities to call themselves, sustainable. And they're actually setting up a certification agency and a series going on to try and get as many buying in around the world. And it is largely voluntary, although not for free. Although now I believe some major international agency are funding them through NGOs. But the whole idea is to have at least a minimum set of criteria dealing with the treatment people give to their environment, to the community, to the animals, as part of a standard which other work that we're doing through various agencies to get people to demand higher standards if they choose to go there. So it is trying to make a difference at a global level, again, one visit at a time. But yeah, it's always cumulative. And this has been, I think each of us have run into this before. You can usually do one thing, but trying to do all things is a huge standard, and I'm a geographer. I understand scale very well, but I still can't solve it.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Julia.
No, just echoing what Ted just said. It's well said, and interesting, the model to look at tourism and standards as an entry point for that.
Yeah, because the World Wildlife Fund is one of the partners with us in it, and so is the Rainforest Alliance, and so is a number of major tourism organizations and so on. So I keep leaning on the idea of partners, and we brought small island development states in at the same time, because between them they have an awful lot of common goals if we can only get them to work together.
I'm going to next ask Tom Powers to unmute himself, followed by by Marilyn, followed by David Corton, followed by Gabriella. So if each of you would begin to think about unmuting yourself. Tom, how does this fit in with your vast global experience and your experience of people and communities making themselves more well?
Well, first, thank you, Ted, for an incredible tour, if you will, of the tourism industry and what things are happening there. It's been such a bad year for travel. A couple of years really, and I myself, I'm as always, I'm fascinated by your finding, and I think everyone would agree that communication is essential in establishing the commonality, the groundwork for decision making, and coming up with ideas and strategies for doing what we want to do and what really needs to be done. I'm also thinking of what I have been involved in recently, which is my small community of medical people in California, and deciding upon priorities for what the California Medical Association and my own county medical association can prioritize and attempt to persuade policymakers to do in what we feel to be the interests of the general health and well-being of the community. And that gets to, behavioral change. And that's always been the nux of any intervention strategy or plan. And I'm just sitting here thinking about, all of the places. My son has a book. It says, it's 1,000 places to see before you die. And I've been through that book a couple of times, and I've still got several hundred yet to go. And quite a few of them are, covered in your brief survey of what you're doing in the world today. But I want to thank you. And I don't have much to say except that, again, I am very much daunted by the challenge, and at the same time willing to re-engage as soon as it's safe to fly.
Yeah, we're being in the tourism industry. I'd love to be somewhere else. I think this is the first time I've spent a whole year in my country ever. But the point is that there are a lot of opportunities out there to bring people together. And in fact, I'm hoping each of you, as you weigh in as we go through this process, can bring other success stories and ways in which we can, in fact, use them as building blocks and build on each other. And that's really what Anitra and I have been arguing with the rest of you on this one too. The idea being we put all the gray cells together in one pile, it might be something worth listening to. And I think we're moving the marker a little bit, but the challenge for us is to come up with something that resonates between us, and we're hoping, I'd say, in about in a few months at least, to take something forward more collectively, at least a report to the Club of Rome on findings on what we think might make a difference, to see if they'll get behind it too. But so again, we're wide open to any suggestions or ideas regarding what that might be and how we get there from here. But it's very clear that everybody has something to offer. And as I said earlier, it's an awful lot easier to ask questions in some of these areas than to come up with answers. But I think it's important we do ask the questions.
Marilyn, how does this fit in with your communities in Asia, Afghanistan, and throughout the Western Hemisphere?
Well, I wanted to really address the Western Hemisphere right now. Right now in Afghanistan, we're in the middle of a very challenging moment in terms of keeping our people who work there safe.
Ouch.
So the community is really in I don't want to say disarray, but it's in a paralyzed state right now. But I wanted to talk to you about Ojai, where I live, which is a beautiful community of 8,000 people in the community and 8,000 people surrounding the community. We've been known as an environmental haven. There are no fast food restaurants here. You're not allowed to cut down trees. And even the signs in town have to be made of redwood.
Yep.
And it's a community that gathers together around its people, whether it's young children. We have a program called Secure Beginnings, caring for young children 0 through 5, and backward fencing, and then on through teenage years. But our challenge is that some of the members of the city council began to promote our town. And I think this is a microcosm of what Ted was talking about, what Julia was talking about. So this little town that is just gorgeous and people come here for that reason has now been in Condé Nast and LA Times and all over. And we are completely swamped with tourists at a time when we have no water. And so the town is struggling with people who want to bring in money versus keeping the natural culture and the beauty and the sustainability of our town. And luckily, our city council is beginning to create community forums to speak, because we've always been a group that comes together. But I've never seen us take a dive like this in terms of how we're managing the town and the ramifications. And I think about what would have happened to in Bhutan if that decision had made, and what happened in our little town because a decision was made, a simple one, just to promote our town in various magazines. So we are now carrying, many more people on the weekends than we can afford to manage. And you can see the degradation happening in the water and in the springs, in the areas where people used to go hike, that right now are having to be re-nurtured because of the amount of people coming and taking advantage without an understanding of the beauty of this area and the fragility.
Yeah, well, and we have an identical one in Banff and in Jasper in the northern Canada. The only difference being that the government some years ago declared both of them as communities within the national park boundary, and therefore has a number of tools to provide limits that you don't have in Ojai or in Jackson Hole, for that matter. And these are issues. I mean, I'm happy to talk to you about it, because I have some very specific case studies on the tools, levers we do have should people wish to use them in very similar situations. But again, it's actually easier to stop growth than to let it happen, but it's not popular.
Very good. I really would like to connect with you.
I have next David, but Van has an emergency, needs to run off. So could Van please say what he needs? He has comments. Thank you, Van.
Van, you're muted.
I'm not now. Ted, that was just outstanding. I must say I had no idea of the magnitude of the tourist industries.
1 in 5 jobs globally.
Something came to mind that there's a kind of a displacement between the massive amount of people and equipment, everything else coming in to small places like Maryland's just commenting about Ojai and the place with the 7 cruise ships in a day. And things like quantum physics, there's certain thing as the observer effect. Observer changes what's being observed, and if there's something innately difficult about having large numbers of people coming to small places where mere fact of the scale, like an invasion, it's very difficult to keep what you want to come see if too many people do it. So to me, there must be some kind of a way to consider ethical guidelines or something for tourists, for visitors, for people who come to these places that haven't been disturbed, so they can see them like they are, not undisturbed, and to do it in such a way that it doesn't change what they're coming to see. That's it. I don't know the answer to that at all, but it seems like that's another place to put some attention. You know,
That's essentially how I've made a living the last while. Going in, where like China's been bringing me in because they have places where they now traffic lights on trails because two columns of 10,000 people try and cross without killing each other. That's in the Zhejiang where they shot Avatar, and where there's lineups of people, and it's all they can do to design them so they don't shove each other off the bridges and off the cliffs. I do have pictures of those too. I am a photographer, and I get to take neat stuff while I'm there. But the point being that, yeah, people are like lemmings. You know, that essentially we mass, we create masses. It's like like going to rock concerts. You know, that suddenly absolutely everybody wants to be there under any circumstances, and trying to get people to behave is not easy. Disney's super at it, actually, and so is the government of Spain. I mean, if you want to go to the Alhambra, you must book about now. The same thing in the Gaudi Cathedral in Barcelona, because you're going to have a ticket, and it has a particular time on it, and it only lets you stay in for about an hour and a half max. You have to book well in advance. In fact, in summertime, up to 6 months in advance. And the one thing they haven't done is charge you is put it on a market basis, because we were trying to do that with the West Coast Trail in British Columbia, where everybody wanted to go on the July 1st to 4th weekend. And we know only 300 people can be ecologically supported on that trail a day without causing ecological damage. So we essentially right now it's still first come first served. So if you're not the third person on at 6 a.m, you're not going to get it. But we were I was trying to convince them to actually auction the places, so that it was going to cost you a fortune to go on the July 4th weekend. But if you went at a gray day in November, you're probably going to get it for free.
David, we haven't heard from you yet. Please give us your remarks on this.
Okay, this is a very important and fascinating discussion. I'm particularly struck by Ted's most recent remarks about this crowding. It all raises a really interesting question. How much tourism do we want, and for what purpose? Now, if it's for relaxation, getting away from work, we can do that very well locally without going anywhere. If it is to see the wonders of the world, as we've just expressed, if we all go out with our bucket list to visit every wonder of the world, the wonders of the world no longer exist as wonders of the world. And we're ignoring the technology that we have now, that with IMAX capabilities, we can be giving the experience of seeing in a local theater without overpowering these places of beauty. Given all my experience living around the world and traveling around the world, I would suggest that we ought to encourage our very young to travel to some exotic place in their life, but not for a 2 or 3 day visit, but to actually live there
with people in depth for a period of time, develop lifetime relationships that they can maintain subsequently electronically to keep people connected. More of that should also take place locally. Again, I realized my first trips from the United States to Asia and immersion in these exotic cultures. When I got back home, I realized that there were a lot of exotic cultures right next door to where I live that I had no awareness of. And I would have been getting exposed to those. So anyhow, these are some of the questions that
David,
come to my mind about a fundamental rethinking.
Everything you said is very right, and in fact, we need to recruit you to help us use the economic instruments effectively to be such a barrier. The biggest issue we found is only North Korea and Cuba have been able to stop their people from traveling, and it's not a model that we've been pushing. But the issue really is like Venice. Everybody wants to go there. Suddenly, it's so crowded that no one wants to go there. So it's a major issue for that sector because, and if you've of course been to the beaches in Europe in this time of year, you can't even drive within 5 miles of some of them, and they're hanging their bicycles in the trees along along the coast. So it is the picture behind me at the moment is just one of the paths through the area at Avatar where they did Avatar, and it's one of about 50 miles of paths that are crammed with people, and they get up to 5 million people a day in there, and they have major elevators that take people up and down at about 500 each in each elevator up to the head, and then they have buses running along through the area. And that's before the bullet train arrived a couple of years ago from Beijing, because it was a long way to get there until then. Now it's about 7 hours. So I have no idea what it's like now, but I was working with them to try and develop standards and limits. And the time the Chinese were not that interested in using economic instruments except to charge foreigners. They saw it as a social good for their own people, and therefore were keeping the prices low. As a result, they were being overwhelmed in terms of the volumes of people coming through. So the answer is it's worth, we've had some interesting discussions on them, but like in any culture, the instruments you can get away with using are not socially acceptable in every different culture.
But that's our challenge that we face. I mean,
is,
if we're going to have any human future, we have to have deep change in every aspect of how we live, and we've got to figure out how to achieve that.
Mm-hmm. No, and this is another thing. We can certainly focus on instruments that do work. I didn't spend a lot of time on success stories of instruments which have actually made a difference in some places. It'd be worth another discussion someday on that. That book I put at the end has dozens of them in it. It's a sort of compendium from 62 authors that we put together a few years ago on really the ways to deal with over tourism in different ways. And there's some very decent new books out right now on the same subject, but they're all very case study specific. And can we generalize? I don't know.
I was struck by, you said that some of the communities were transformational models based on their shared visions.
Yeah.
And I assume that's after the tensions between the different visions of a community got worked out.
Yep.
But how did they transform the community?
Well, what they're doing is that they've changed the community from just being a farming community or a fishing community into mainly the ones I was dealing with in servicing natural areas, people who wanted to visit them. And the best one I can think of is one in Costa Rica, where they got all the local people to be the wardens, to manage the area, to to go out and identify all of those areas that were most sensitive according to their own culture and their traditions, and to discuss where they would let people come and how many at a time and when they were not allowed in during particular cultural ceremonies because they would interfere with them. A range of different cultural aspects were brought into the actual planning and management. And that comes right down to now, therefore, we only have 200 parking places in the parking lot because that's the most prepared to actually accommodate at one time. It goes right through from the idea of concept right through. And when you're looking at transformational communities, you're looking at not just sustaining what you may have now, but can you in fact create sustainability plus, where you start creating a vision of where you want to be in 20 to 50 years time and start building towards it. And that means putting restraints in as well as building things and establishing sets of rules. And what we've said with the UN is always set the rules up before you let the tourists in. Otherwise, it's going to be a mess.
So the challenge is limiting the tourism.
Yep. Yeah, right now there are some places it's being done, and certainly in individual places that is being done. I mean, like Piran in Croatia or in Slovenia, there's only room for 100 cars near the community. It's a beautiful little community on the coast. And you have to walk from there, or for people who can't walk, there's a bus about once every half hour that lets you off in the center. But they're not letting any more people in at a time. And there's a guard on the gate. And at the moment, it's not charged other than to pay for the parking. But you could actually have fairly rigid entry rules if you really wanted to, and it's a live community.
When you said that you tried to scale the challenges,
yeah,
I assume in these many books, of which I have not read the 23, that you give the wisdom from the various communities to other communities which have the same problems, such as the space problem constraint, the fragility of the ecosystem constraint, the fragility of the cultural habitat or cultural heritage constraint. So I assume that they learn from one another, and then does that help them carry out their vision?
Yeah,
And
I'm
scaling?
just flip through to this alone. Oops, I stopped. It didn't want to do it. Okay, I'll try again. I was going to share the screen with you with one particular thing here that will show this. That's probably the best piece of work because it's 400 pages. It has dozens of case studies, and it's essentially a planning guidebook of sustainability for, and that's we've done a lot since, but it is designed specifically to be advice to communities around the world. And it's now in use in over 100 countries as a Bible or as a component of their planning process. So I can certainly make that available to anybody who wants it. I have the right to share it because otherwise the UN would charge you a fortune. But
yeah, at the end of the day, I see one of the problems of this group is how to give any kind of instruction about scaling up.
yeah,
And I know how we do it in regeneration of fundamental habitats. We go to scientific meetings, we go to regional meetings, and we talk in detail about the best practices, and then we published in certain various forestry or coastal or whatever. That's how we scale up and disseminate the information. But this is probably very different with these diverse communities around the world. So I'm just wondering whether we'll be able to amalgamate or integrate this scaling information as one of the lessons in what we're doing together now.
Yeah, there are many different disciplines involved. And certainly if you are interested in coastal zone management, there are conferences every year, often people going to the places. So this year, no. The same thing for mountain communities, the same thing for farm tourism. And there are different associations for all of them. And they come together the same as they do with the others all around the world.
Okay.
Not, but can I, I'm at the risk of seeming silly, I don't really mean to be, but the discussion of, limitations of space made me think of recently, we saw the Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk models. Do they have any application here? I mean, they're basically economic models, I think, but they found a way to explore and limit the number of tourists.
Mm-hmm. It's just price.
The price. What would
now,
the price,
if your idea of tourism is the bridal suite at the top of the best hotel in Singapore, you can't afford it.
right?
And so any industry works that way. So yeah, all of the economic instruments we usually use to limit numbers are functional as long as people are prepared to do it. But I can't tell them to put a $500 a day price on the West Coast Trail because there's an awful lot of locals and natives who would love to walk it and can't afford to. So there are so many other factors that come into the actual decision of how to do those.
John Gilmore had another question.
Yeah. Before I speak, I know Julia had her hand up before me. So maybe after Julia's made comments, I can.
Go ahead, John. I'll just build on whatever you wanted to share.
Okay. Well, I want to go back to Ted's points about why we travel and whether that's the point, that we really need to examine, because he made a very telling point when he said, if it's relaxation, is this a re-education that is required to activate relaxation space, which is proximal, so that we're not depriving any human being of the opportunity to be in nature and to be integrated into natural context in order to be fully human, but at the same time not making it the privilege of those who can afford. And as much as we work with empowering communities where tourism is a priority to uplift themselves, there seems to be a strange, perverse end game to that, where the very thing that they are selling, if you like, in their tourism begins to become sordid or affected by that travel. And it's not a necessary equation, but it seems to be quite a common one. So this in a sense, the reimagining here does require something like, I think David suggested quite arbitrarily, the idea that young people have the right to travel once or twice, and then the engagement must be to engage deep in the community. Now, having in South Africa received many American tourists into the project space which I coordinate, it's an unnerving experience, and it comes loaded with danger. And of course, the danger is two-sided, but the danger for the South African experience is people's assumptions and the entitlement that comes with paying a high price to travel in one's country gives them the right to pass opinions and to actually treat the people in that country as beggars, as somebody who's deserving of small token gifts. And we've often had situations where tourists come and say, we brought a whole lot of pencils because we know that a pencil can change the life of an African child. Now, a pencil cannot change the life of an African child, no matter how you spin that. It's just not true. And yet somebody's got an anecdote as to how, somebody once said a pencil changed his life. And as I said, if you carry a box of pencils under your arm, and you ask a child if that pencil will change his life, just like me, he would say yes, because the pencil becomes the object of desire. So I am very awakened in this conversation by the tension between the economic empowerment that obviously comes when you empower a community to be hosts, and then this disabling continuation of an economic divide that plays out almost inevitably with layers and layers of current tourist practice.
There's both your last comments resonate because, bringing people to actually contact others has its own repercussions, but so does giving them a virtual experience.
Yeah.
And when we did try virtual to see whether or not we could substitute virtual experiences for actual ones, it actually ended up as a lost leader for more people to come. So it's not really predictable as to whether we're going to get more or less people. But if you show them a beautiful voyage down a beach and they think it's wonderful, the odds are they're probably going to want to go there.
Except for outer space. I think I'd prefer a virtual tour
Bungee
to
jumping,
outer
on the other
space.
hand.
I'm not at all sure. I'm used to that kind of pull of the G's. Julia?
Yeah, just thinking
And
about
then David.
Yeah.
Thanks, Anitra. Just thinking about one of the other paradigm shifts that's coming to my mind, listening to this conversation, as well as the K-Core conversation on climate change a while ago, is this paradigm of freedom and individual freedom. And it came up when David was talking a little bit about how much travel should we be allowed. And I can remember a time when it was difficult to travel because you couldn't get on the internet and book a $50 flight. You actually had to go through a travel agent. And there was something very precious about that experience too. Looking at my own life, I became way too casual about traveling. I'm not doing that again. COVID has really woken me up to that. So coming back to the freedom, I wonder if this new era that is so much more conscious of the limits will now encourage governments to tell us, there is maybe a certain number of travel that we're allowed as individuals over the course of our lives. Maybe there's a certain number of cars that we're allowed, or, without it kind of veering off into this weird fascist thing. It's something that we collectively agree on, and that it's not seen as a deprivation, and it's done with a lens towards equity. So just to say that this idea of everybody has as much freedom to get as much as they can buy, and that's the common denominator, there's something much more refined and enlightened about how we make those decisions, and that policy starts to align with that. There's something very wrong with everybody who's got money just being able to buy as many tickets and fly as many times as they want, which is what's been happening. And I put myself in that basket as well. So just to throw that out as a possible paradigm kind of question that's coming up for me at this time.
David, you had some comments.
Yeah, it's interesting where this conversation is taking us, just picking up on what Julia just said. What if we outlawed all or prohibited all airplane flights that have a return flight within a week? If you're going to fly someplace, it should be because you have something you really need to do there. But I also think about this in terms of the deeper questions in the United States, at least. One of our huge problems is the political divide between the urban and the rural, the extraordinary disconnect between the urban and the rural. And when we talk about vacationing, we talk about relaxing. We may talk about connecting with other people, but very few of our tourism events are really about connecting with other people. They're just looking at other places. But what if more of our local vacationing was part of our urban-rural connection? That basically part of the civilization we need to move toward is a stronger connection between urban and rural. It's part of jumping the political divide, but recognizing that our food and our water, much of our energy comes from rural places, and we as urban people need to know that, and we need to connect. And so thinking about more of our recreation and tourism, if you want to call it that, of visiting local places near where we live. But if we're in the city, getting out into the countryside, being with nature for a short period of time in ways that are not harmful to nature. And the same then for the rural people, that they may want an urban experience for their vacation, get some culture and some art and so forth. Begin to think about this in more holistic ways rather than simply running from one place to another because somehow we saw a tourist magazine and we want to check off our bucket list.
Remember, the impact of COVID, at least in my country, is that that's starting to happen. The urban and rural, because they're not allowed out of their country, but a lot of people are going in their own country. And the options are to fly or fly less, not drive. But also, the perception was that driving is safer because you're with your family and safe, and you're not interfacing with others, and you can eat in your car. So that at least is a temporary glitch, and so we're learning certain things regarding the repercussions. I mean, I could rent my cottage for about $1,000 a week. Right, or a day right this summer because of urban people. There aren't enough cottages to go around, and there's a market, but I want it. So everything comes down to that. But we are finding changes now. The other thing that's happening that in some ways jives is people are trying to package tours that do less. The idea of 7 countries in 7 days, where you're going 1,000 miles each night, isn't there much anymore. Instead, you fly to Spain and you spend 2 weeks in Spain and then fly back. Or even the cruise ships are discovering that the people are more and more people want a 2-week rather than a 5-day cruise. But there still are other people who of course have different perceptions. Can we fix it? Well, there's a lot of work going on to try and do it, but no results yet that could be very, very fruitful.
Tom.
I'm just thinking, 50 years ago or so, when I was living and working in, well, we called it then Disneyland East, inside the Beltway, when I was working at Peace Corps. My then wife and I used to like to get out of town, and we loved to go up to Western Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. And there we enjoyed the opportunity to visit with and stay for a weekend, or even maybe a long weekend or a week in the Amish country. And here's a culture which exists today, and they've solved a lot of these problems. Oddly or beautifully enough, they have, many of the things that we've talked about that are problems and obstacles. They've just worked that out in a very traditional cultural fashion.
Yeah, that's one of many success stories we need to learn from.
Yeah, I'm just amazed at all these conversations about travel simply being getting on a plane and going someplace and seeing 6 monuments, because to me, when I travel, I'm looking at how what the ecosystem is and was, and how that relates to the industries or businesses or urban centers there, and how that relates to the culture of the people. And I mean, I've signed up for work assignments in, God knows, Equatorial Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, and all kinds of crazy places, so that I could experience this other kind of ecosystem. But perhaps that's because I'm an ecologist and I just have an overwhelming curiosity about all the different points of the earth. But I can't imagine just getting on a plane and looking at a picture and therefore flying off to Kazakhstan or something, and then flying back and saying, okay, this is a check on my belt, like another.
We should let Marilyn have one more to say before she goes. She says Marilyn. She's got to go. You're muted, Marilyn. You're muted. Yeah.
You're muted.
There you are.
I just think this might be an opportunity for a wonderful article. Because this is a commonly held assumption. And even before we spoke, I had not really looked at the depth of what this means. I really think how many times I jump on a plane just because I jump on a plane. And I think that people would be receptive to
Yeah.
considering this. I mean, if it's not discussed openly, it just continues to be. So it might be something we could produce easily with the talent here that could make a difference.
David, didn't you and I talk about the idea of somebody having a global limit on consumption described in some way, like a lifetime pass, or the same way we sort of have a 100-mile diet being? Are any of these kinds of things going to fly?
How would everybody like to do this? Are we ready to thank Ted and have an overview that perhaps David could sum up for us, or are we satisfied with our interaction up to this time? All those who would like to continue, raise their hand. Okay, so I think we're coming close to the end. And I thank Ted very much for this very provoking idea of where community, which has morphed, transformed into well-being communities with much labor and questioning and work on the part of the communities have gone. And they're all obviously a work in progress. None of them have come to their final point, but we've learned a large lesson, and we thank Ted for doing that for us. David, did you have some last comments before we shuffle off this mortal coil?
Just very quickly, that I think where this has actually ended up is where these conversations ideally should go, in terms of taking a conventional framework. How do we grow the tourist industry in ways that are sustainable, to how do we fundamentally rethink our whole relationship with travel and community? And this is very much where we need to go if we're taking talking in terms of a fundamental paradigmatic shift in how we see ourselves as human beings and our relationship to one another and to the living earth.
David, I agree. And my concept of well-being definitely doesn't include 18 hours sitting in an airplane seat.
Yes.
Julia, any final comments?
Yeah, I think it would be really worthwhile to explore. And as Nadine was saying, the timing couldn't be better as people are starting to rethink COVID and travel and all of that. And I think there is an aspect of it that is about connecting to purpose and meaning in a human life in a finite planet. So it's striking that balance between we have to do this because of climate change, and actually this would actually nourish our sense of well-being and community and groundedness. So it's addressing both of those elements, which to me is what a well-being economy offers that's different. It's not just about, oh, it's all going to be worth, we all have these rules now, we have to toe the line, but actually this leads to a flourishing and a reawakening of what it means to be human on a planet with finite resources. So I think it's very much in the flavor of what the Club of Rome should be thinking and writing about.
Yeah, it's part of a reframing that what we're talking about is not a sacrifice.
Yes.
It's actually a gain.
Yes. And we can point out the underlying forces that have driven us to this kind of ridiculous way of looking at travel and consumption, because that would be one of the things people would say is, but you're taking away our freedom. But it's not like these choices and this lifestyle just happened on its own in a vacuum. It's what happens when you put travel on the internet, when you have Facebook pages with everybody's travel things and the bucket list mentality, when Expedia bases its prices on flights based on market values and it fluctuates from day to day.